Bavaria, Germany, August 1945. The war had been over for 3 months. You would not have known it from the roads. The roads through what remained of southern Germany were still lined with the wreckage of the army that had once believed it would rule the world for 1,000 years. Burned-out hulks of tanks sat in the ditches where they had died, their gun barrels pointing at nothing. Farmhouses stood with their roofs caved in, their walls blackened, their windows empty as the eyes of men who had seen too much and come back changed. The bridges had been blown and blown again and rebuilt again, and the new construction looked exactly like what it was, something temporary holding together something that had been broken past the point of easy repair. 3 months after the greatest military victory in American history, Germany looked like the end of the world, and in some ways it was. But in the cities, in the occupation zones, in the requisitioned estates and repurposed government buildings where the victorious armies had set up their headquarters, something else was happening. Something quieter and in many ways more dangerous than anything that had happened when the guns were still firing. The Americans and the Soviets, who had spent 4 years fighting toward each other from opposite ends of a burning continent, were now standing face to face in the middle of that continent, and nobody in either army had been given clear instructions about what happened next. On paper, they were allies. The official photographs showed them that way. American generals and Soviet marshals shaking hands in front of flags, smiling for cameras, erasing glasses at receptions organized to demonstrate the unity of the victorious powers. The photographs looked exactly like what they were supposed to look like. But the men in those photographs knew something the cameras did not capture, which was that the handshakes were careful, the smiles were calculated, and the glasses were raised with the particular precision of men who understood that one wrong word in the wrong room could undo everything the last 4 years had been built toward. In the summer of 1945, the real war had not ended. It had simply changed its weapons. Sergeant Roy Decker understood this before most people did. He was 28 years old from a small town in western Pennsylvania that most Americans couldn't have found on a map. And he had spent the last 2 years of the war driving a general who seemed constitutionally incapable of going anywhere slowly. Decker was not a strategist. He was not a diplomat. He had no opinion about the geopolitics of occupation zones or the future of European reconstruction. What he had was a driver's particular skill for reading the atmosphere of a vehicle, the way the temperature of a car changes depending on what the man in the back seat is thinking, and what he had learned from 2 years of driving General Wade Harlan was that when Harlan went quiet, something significant was about to happen. On the evening of the Bavaria reception, Harlan was very quiet. Decker drove the staff car through the gates of the requisition estate where the reception was being held, and felt the silence in the back seat like a physical presence. For he had driven Harlan to command meetings, to field hospitals, to the sites of battles still warm from the fighting. He had driven him through the rain and the mud of the Rhineland, and across the bridges that engineers had thrown across rivers in the dark. In all of that, Harlan had talked. He was a man who thought out loud, who processed the world through language, who could not sit in a moving vehicle without commenting on what he saw through the window or what he was planning to do about whatever problem was currently at the top of the stack. Tonight, nothing. Decker pulled the car to a stop in front of the main entrance. 2 MPs were standing at attention on either side of the door. A line of staff cars was already parked along the circular drive. American and Soviet vehicles mixed together with the slightly uncomfortable proximity of animals from different territories sharing the same watering hole. Through the tall windows of the estate, Decker could see the orange glow of electric lights and the shadows of people moving inside. Harlan did not move immediately. He sat in the back seat for a long moment, looking at the building with the expression he sometimes wore before particularly difficult operations. Not nervousness. Harlan did not do nervousness. Something more like calibration, a man adjusting the settings of himself before walking into a situation that required specific and careful settings. Then he said without turning his head, "Roy, sir, tonight I want you close to the door." Decker had driven Harlan long enough to know that this was not a casual instruction. How close, sir?" "Close enough that if I need to leave quickly, we leave quickly." He said nothing else. He opened the door himself, straightened his uniform with two precise adjustments of his jacket, and walked up the steps into the building. Decker sat for a moment after he was gone, watching the door close behind him. Then he pulled the car around to a position near the entrance, cut the engine, and waited. He would not understand until years later exactly what had been communicated in that exchange. But he understood enough to know that whatever was going to happen inside that building tonight, General Harlan had already decided how he was going to handle it, and that decision had been made before the car even stopped. To understand what happened at the Bavaria reception, you have to understand what kind of man walked through that door. Wade Harlan was 60 years old in the summer of 1945, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent 4 decades preparing for a specific kind of work and had then done that work with a completeness that left very little room for anything else. He was built along lines that suggested function rather than elegance. His face was the face of a man who had spent significant portions of his life outdoors in difficult weather, and his eyes had the particular quality you sometimes see in people who have looked at very hard things for very long and have not looked away. They were intelligent eyes, and they were direct eyes, and they were, most of the time, slightly unsettling to people who met them for the first time. So he had commanded the Third Army through the campaign in France and Germany with a speed and operational efficiency that military historians would spend decades arguing about. He had moved faster than anyone thought possible, covered ground that conventional military logic said could not be covered, and done it with casualties that were low relative to the distances advanced and the objectives achieved. His men, the soldiers who had ridden in his tanks and walked behind his infantry and dug his foxholes, had opinions about him that ranged across the full spectrum from worship to rage, sometimes in the same man, sometimes in the same sentence. But almost none of them would have argued that he did not know how to fight a war. The results were in the record. The record did not lie. What the record also showed, and what his superiors in Washington and at Allied headquarters had spent considerable energy managing, was that Harlan was a man entirely incapable of performing a version of himself that was different from the actual version. Most generals of his rank and era had developed a public self, a carefully maintained presentation suitable for press conferences and diplomatic occasions and the inevitable political requirements of high command. They had learned to say the required things in the required ways, to express appropriate caution, to frame their opinions in language that left room for institutional interpretation. Harlan had never learned this, or perhaps more accurately, he had learned it and had made a conscious decision at some point early in his career that he was not going to do it. He said what he thought. He said it directly. He said it whether or not it was convenient, whether or not it was politic, whether or not the people in the room wanted to hear it. This had cost him. It had cost him time and rank and opportunity and the goodwill of superiors who might otherwise have given him more support. It had generated controversies that had followed him through his career like weather systems, building and dissipating and building again. And it had never once changed him. The specific thing he had been saying for the better part of a year, the thing that made his superiors most uncomfortable and that had been creating the most persistent difficulties for the people who managed Allied relations, was his assessment of the Soviet Union. Not as an ally, as a future enemy. He had been saying this since before the war ended, in terms that were direct enough to cause diplomatic incidents and persistent enough to suggest that he was not going to stop saying it regardless of the consequences. While other American commanders maintained the carefully diplomatic language of the wartime alliance, speaking of Soviet sacrifices with appropriate respect, framing the Allied relationship in terms of shared values and common purpose, Harlan was telling anyone who would listen that the Red Army was not a partner in any meaningful sense, that it was an instrument of a system that had different goals and different values and a fundamentally different vision of what post-war Europe should look like, and that the United States had made a strategic error of enormous consequence by stopping at the Elbe River rather than pushing east while the American military was still the most powerful conventional fighting force on the planet. That what was being constructed in the occupation zones and in the diplomatic conferences was not a foundation for lasting peace, but a framework for a conflict that had not yet found its form. These were not popular opinions. They were not popular with General Richard Calloway, who commanded Allied forces in the European theater and who had spent the better part of the war managing the delicate mechanics of the Allied coalition. Calloway was 55 years old, a West Point man, when methodical and politically intelligent in the way that men become politically intelligent when they have spent decades navigating the distance between what is militarily correct and what is institutionally possible. He was not a man without principle. He was a man who had learned, through long experience, that principle without pragmatism accomplishes nothing, and that the art of command at the highest levels is not choosing between good and bad options, but between bad options and worse ones. Calloway respected Harlan's operational record. He had relied on it. The Third Army's advance through France and into Germany had been the kind of performance that made a theater commander's career, and Calloway understood that a significant portion of what history would say about the Allied campaign in the West rested on what Harlan had done with the forces and the fuel and the impossible timelines he had been given. He did not underestimate the man. He did not dislike the man. What he could not manage and what had been creating an increasing volume of difficulty in the months since the German surrender was the man's absolute refusal to understand that the war they were now fighting, the war of occupation and diplomacy and post-war architecture, required a different set of weapons than the one that had just ended. Calloway had raised this with Harlan directly, more than once in terms that were as frank as his temperament allowed. He had explained the strategic necessity of maintaining the Soviet alliance through the current period. He had laid out, with the patience of a man who understood complexity and was trying to share that understanding, why the public statements Harlan was making about the Soviets were damaging relationships that had been built at enormous cost, and that were essential to the post-war framework being constructed in diplomatic conferences from Paris to San Francisco. He had asked Harlan directly to be more careful. Harlan had listened to all of this with the expression of a man receiving information he did not find useful. He had not argued. He had not been rude. He had simply continued doing exactly what he had been doing. Because in Harlan's operational logic, the truth of a situation did not change based on who found it inconvenient. Patton, and adjusting your public position to match what powerful people preferred to hear was a form of deception that he was not able to sustain, even when the people asking him to sustain it were his own superiors. This was the accumulated history between two men, one who had decided the post-war world required management of difficult truths, one who had decided it required the opposite, that walked into the Bavaria reception on the same side of the room and stood for most of the evening, carefully apart. What almost nobody knew on the evening of that reception, what would not become known until decades later when files that had been locked in Moscow archives were finally opened, was that General Wade Harlan had not originally been on the guest list. The invitation process had been managed through Allied headquarters, and Calloway's staff had assembled the American delegation with the particular care of people who understood that the guest list was itself a diplomatic document. Calloway knew this. He had been navigating these calculations for years, and one of the calculations he had made was that Wade Harlan should not be in the room. The reasons were obvious. Harlan had been making public statements about the Soviet Union that were, in the diplomatic language of the time, unhelpful. He was known to be direct in social settings to a degree that created problems in ordinary American interactions, and the prospect of him in a room with senior Soviet officers was not something that Calloway's staff contemplated with equanimity. The initial guest list did not include Harlan, and then the Soviet delegation submitted its own document, a list of American officers whose presence they specifically requested. It was framed as a gesture of respect, an expression of the Soviet desire to engage with the American commanders who had played the most significant roles in the European campaign. It was, on its surface, entirely reasonable. Wade Harlan's name was on that list. Calloway's staff spent 2 days trying to find a diplomatic way to explain why the Americans could not accommodate this specific request. They did not find one. To decline would have been to suggest that the Americans were hiding something, that they were reluctant to allow their own commanders to engage with their Soviet counterparts. In the end, Calloway added Harlan to the list. He told himself it was manageable. He had. In months of working with Harlan, accumulated considerable evidence that this was not how Harlan operated, and he ignored that evidence because the alternative was worse. The Soviet delegation, when they received confirmation that Harlan would attend, made no particular comment. What was recorded in the intelligence file, the file that would sit locked in a Moscow archive for nearly 50 years, was a single annotation in the margin of the confirmation document. 3 words in Russian, in the handwriting of the officer who had submitted the original request. The translation, when it was finally made, was approximately, "Good, he's coming." Marshal Viktor Volkov had asked for Wade Harlan specifically because he wanted Harlan in that room, not to honor him, because he had been given a task by the system that had made him, and Wade Harlan was the task. Viktor Volkov was 58 years old, and he was possibly the most dangerous man in any room he walked into, which was saying something given the rooms he had walked into during the previous 4 years. He had commanded Soviet forces through battles of a scale and brutality that most Western officers could not fully conceptualize, even from the historical record. The Eastern Front was not a campaign in any sense that Western military experience provided useful analogies for. It was something different in kind as well as scale. A war within a war, fought across distances and in conditions and with losses that still resist easy comprehension. Volkov had been at the center of it. He had commanded armies, then army groups, then entire fronts. He had stopped German advances that everyone else had concluded were unstoppable. He had organized counteroffensives in conditions that military logic said were unsuitable for offensive operations. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the physical presence of someone who had spent decades in environments where physical presence mattered. His uniform was covered in decorations to a degree that seemed almost theatrical until you looked closely and understood that each one represented something specific and earned. He moved through rooms with the careful, deliberate quality of a man who had learned that every room contains information if you pay attention, and Volkov had been paying attention to rooms for his entire adult life. What had shaped him into what he was at 58 was not primarily the German army, though he had fought it as thoroughly as any officer in any military in the history of modern warfare. What had shaped him was the system he worked within. He had survived Stalin's purges of the late 30s, when the Soviet military leadership had been decimated by an ideological campaign that removed experienced officers on the basis of political suspicion, rather than professional performance. He had been arrested, interrogated, held in conditions that destroyed men who were physically stronger than he was, and then released and returned to command because the German invasion had made his particular skills necessary, and necessity was the one argument that consistently moved Stalin. Then purged again, years later, for reasons that were never entirely clear. Then rehabilitated again. Twice the system had tried to consume him. Or twice he had come back out of it. This process had produced a man of extraordinary capability and equally extraordinary coldness. Volkov was not sentimental. He understood that in the system he inhabited, a man survived by being useful, and by being careful, and by never allowing his personal feelings to override his political calculations. He had heard about Harlan. The intelligence files were substantial. What the files said was not what the American press said. The American version emphasized controversies, the incidents, the political problems, the moments when Harlan had overstepped. The Soviet assessment was different. It concluded that Harlan was something unusual, a commander who could move large formations fast, who maintained operational coherence under pressure, and who identified and exploited weaknesses with a speed and decisiveness that reflected genuine strategic intuition. The Soviet assessment concluded, annotated in red at the bottom of the file, that Harlan was the only American commander who posed a genuine strategic threat in a future conflict. Not because of his army, because of him, because of the combination of operational talent and genuine belief in what he was doing that made him unpredictable in the specific way that unpredictable was dangerous. A general who truly believed in his enemy was more dangerous than 10 generals who were simply following orders. Volkov had read this assessment carefully. He had understood that his task at the Bavaria reception was not simply to manage a difficult American general. It was to participate in the beginning of the end of that general's career. He was not required to feel anything about this. It was a task. He would perform it. The reception began at 7 in the evening, and for the first hour it was exactly what formal military receptions always are: an exercise in controlled awkwardness, in the performance of camaraderie between people who do not feel it. The estate's main hall had been prepared with military thoroughness. Tables along the walls held food and drink. American and Soviet flags stood at either end of the room. An army band played at a volume calibrated to allow conversation without enabling anyone to clearly hear what anyone else was saying, which in retrospect was doing more diplomatic work than anyone acknowledged. Harlan moved through the room the way he always moved, without particular social grace, but with absolute authority. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, drank approximately half of it, and positioned himself near one of the tall windows where he could see the room without being in the center of it. The Soviet delegation had arrived as a group and remained largely as a group. Volkov was at their center, not formally, not in any way that announced itself, but in the way that a center of gravity works, with everything else in mild orbit around it. Calloway worked the room with the professional ease of a man who had attended hundreds of events like this one and had developed, over years of practice, with the ability to be simultaneously present and absent, to say the right things to the right people while reserving a portion of his attention for the larger dynamics of the room. He watched Harlan by the window. He watched Volkov at the center of the Soviet group. He watched the distance between them and did the calculation that his position required him to do, which was to estimate the probability that the evening would end without an incident serious enough to require management. He estimated it at somewhere around 40%. He had been too optimistic before, with Harlan to trust his own optimism. Decker, standing near the main entrance in his sergeant's uniform with the particular invisibility of enlisted men at officers' events, watched all of it from across the room. He watched Harlan by the window, still and observant. He watched Volkov at the center of the Soviet group, moving slowly, speaking occasionally, but mostly watching. He watched Calloway moving through the room with his glass and his professional smile, pausing here and there, always slightly angled so that he could see both Harlan and the Soviet delegation at the same time. What Decker noticed, and what he would remember clearly enough to describe in detail 40 years later, was that Volkov was watching Harlan. Not constantly, not obviously, but with the steady peripheral attention of a man who is tracking something that matters to him. And Harlan, by the window, was doing the same. Two very different men from very different worlds, watching each other across a room full of champagne and flags and the carefully maintained fiction of Allied unity. Decker moved slightly closer to the door, and he didn't know why. He just felt like he should. Across the room, Harlan finished his champagne, set the glass on a nearby table, and turned to look directly at Viktor Volkov. Volkov, at that same moment, turned to look directly at him. Neither man looked away, and the evening, which had been performing the shape of a celebration, shifted into something else, something that everyone in the room could feel even if they could not have named it. The band kept playing. The conversations continued, but underneath all of it, quiet as a change in barometric pressure before a storm, something had begun. Roy Decker pressed his back against the wall beside the door, folded his hands, and settled into wait. The first move was not a confrontation, it was a compliment. This was Volkov's method, and it was effective precisely because it did not look like a method. He moved through the room with the unhurried ease of a man entirely comfortable in formal settings. He spoke to American officers with the careful courtesy of someone who had been briefed on names and ranks and relevant histories. He accepted introductions with appropriate warmth. He said the right things about the campaign in France, about the crossing of the Rhine, about the final push into Germany. He said them in Russian, through his interpreter, with the measured appreciation of a professional acknowledging professional work. He was very good at this. He had survived in a system where being good at this was as important as anything else. When he finally moved toward Harlan, it was not in a straight line. It was a gradual convergence. The kind that looks accidental until you understand that nothing Volkov did in a room full of people was accidental. He arrived at Harlan's position near the window through a series of conversations that brought him naturally to that part of the hall, and when he turned and found Harlan nearby, he registered an expression of mild and pleasant surprise that was entirely manufactured and entirely convincing. Harlan watched him cross the last few feet and felt absolutely nothing that resembled surprise. The interpreter positioned himself at the appropriate angle. The American interpreter moved into place on the other side. The four of them formed the asymmetric square of a translated conversation, two men speaking and two men relaying, in with the inevitable slight delay that translation creates. A half-beat of silence between what is said and what is understood that changes the rhythm of exchange in ways that can be used by someone who knows how to use them. Volkov knew how to use them. He began with the Eastern Front. This was territory he owned completely, and he moved through it with the confidence of a man walking through his own house in the dark. He described certain operations with the particular specificity of someone who had been present and remembered clearly. The scale of what the Red Army had faced, the conditions, the distances, the losses. He spoke about Soviet soldiers with a gravity that was genuine, because whatever else Volkov was, he had commanded those men and watched them die in numbers that still, even after everything, it registered somewhere inside him. Harlan listened without interrupting. He had the uncommon quality of a man who could listen to something he partly disagreed with without letting the disagreement appear on his face before he was ready to address it. He stood with his arms at his sides, his weight balanced, his expression attentive but neutral. Then Volkov said something that changed the tone. He said it carefully, embedded in context, framed with apparent reasonableness, delivered with the moderate inflection of someone making an obvious observation rather than landing a blow. He said that the American advance through France and into Germany had been impressive in its speed and logistics, which was true. He said that the German forces the Americans had faced in the West were a different proposition from the forces the Red Army had faced in the East, which was also substantially true. And then he said that it was important, in assessing the Allied victory as a whole, to understand the relationship between those two facts, that the Germans who stood in front of the Americans in 1944 and 1945 were not the same Germans who had stood in front of the Red Army in 1941 and 1942, because the Red Army had already broken them. He said this with the calm of a man stating arithmetic. The American interpreter translated it in full, hesitating for approximately half a second before completing the translation, just long enough to register that he understood what he was saying, and then said it, because his job was to say it and because he was a professional. Harlan heard it and was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who has been struck and is recovering, the quiet of a man who has heard something he was expecting and is deciding which of the several available responses is the right one. He said that Marshal Volkov made an interesting point. He said it without irony, so controlled that it did not register as such. He said the operational history of the German army on both fronts was a subject he had studied carefully, and that the study had been instructive. Then he said he would be interested in comparing the operational records of the Third Army with any Soviet formation of equivalent size, campaign by campaign, objective by objective, casualty by casualty. He said he was confident the comparison would produce useful information for everyone present. He said it conversationally, in the same moderate tone Volkov had used. Anyone not paying close attention would not have immediately recognized that what had just happened was two men drawing their sidearms while smiling at each other. Volkov recognized it. His expression did not change. He said he would welcome such a comparison. He said the Red Army's record was one he was proud to have any observer examine closely. He said the scale of operations on the Eastern Front, the distances, the formations, the duration, the conditions, represented a kind of warfare that was difficult to fully appreciate without direct experience of it. The implication was precise and deliberate. Your war was different in kind, not just scale. And different in kind means it cannot be compared on equal terms, because one of them was the real war and the other was something easier. The circle of officers who had drifted into loose proximity around the two of them had gone slightly still. Not obviously. Nobody had stopped their own conversations, but the attention in that corner of the room had shifted in the way it does when something real is happening beneath the surface of something official. Calloway from across the room had stopped moving. He stood with his glass at chest height, watching, doing the internal calculation of a man assessing whether to intervene and concluding, for the moment, that intervention would make it worse. It was the soldiers that opened the real door. Volkov, having established his position, made a decision. He could have continued the oblique approach. It was working. Harlan was engaged and responding, and every response created another opportunity to reframe. But something in Harlan's measured calmness told him the oblique approach would not produce what he needed. Harlan would absorb it indefinitely. The man was constructed for exactly this kind of sustained engagement. Moscow wanted something that looked like an American loss, something specific enough to be credible, something that could be described in a report as a demonstration of American instability. To get that, Volkov needed Harlan to lose his composure. And to do that, he needed to stop aiming at Harlan and aim at something Harlan could not be philosophical about. He aimed at the soldiers. He said, and this time the framing was less careful, the words chosen for impact rather than deniability, that there was a difference between logistical achievement and fighting achievement. That moving quickly through territory, being evacuated by an enemy already in retreat, was a different kind of accomplishment from standing and fighting an enemy who still believed it was going to win. He said that the soldiers of the Red Army had faced the German military at full strength, at full confidence, in the full belief of its own invincibility, that what they had done, stopping that advance, absorbing those losses, holding when everything said holding was impossible, was what actual fighting looked like, and that advancing through France against a German army already broken by the Eastern Front was something else, something that deserved respect, but not the same respect, not equal credit. He delivered this without visible heat, professionally almost, as if presenting a military assessment to a staff conference, rather than telling an American general to his face that his soldiers had fought a lesser war. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. This was the silence of a room understanding that a threshold had been crossed. Harlan looked at Volkov for a long moment. Something had shifted in his expression. Some final decision about exactly what this evening was and what was required of him in it. He had listened. He had been measured. He had given the diplomatic framework every reasonable opportunity to contain what was happening. It had not contained it. He was done with the diplomatic framework. When he said that he had enormous respect for what the soldiers of the Red Army had accomplished on the Eastern Front, he said this first and said it with a specificity that made clear it was not a diplomatic courtesy. He named operations, referenced conditions, acknowledged losses in terms that demonstrated he had actually studied the Eastern Campaign. He said that what Soviet soldiers had endured in the winters of 1941 and 1942 deserved every acknowledgement it had received and more. Then he said that he was going to tell Marshal Volkov something about the men of the Third Army. He said those men had crossed the English Channel in conditions that killed soldiers before they reached the beach. He said they had fought through the hedgerow country of Normandy, which anyone who had examined the tactical situation understood was not the fighting of a retreating enemy, but of one deeply embedded, well-supplied, and prepared to die for every field. He said they had fought through the winter of 1944 in the Ardennes, when the German army had launched its last major offensive with everything it still had, its last reserves of men and armor and fuel and will, and committed them entirely to a single throw of the dice. He said that the men who came across the Rhine had done so against resistance, that the marshal was now choosing to characterize as negligible, and that characterization was an insult to those men that he was not going to allow to stand in a room where Allied officers of both nations were present. He said all of this in the same moderate tone, not raised, not heated. The voice of a man who does not need volume because he has never had any difficulty being heard. Volkov waited until the translation was complete. Then he said the thing he had been building towards since he first walked to that corner of the room. He said that it was easy, in a reception hall with champagne in hand and a war recently won, to speak with great confidence about what one's soldiers had accomplished. He said that the real measure of a soldier, and of a general, was not what was said in comfortable rooms, but what was done when the ground was shaking and the casualty reports were coming in and there was no champagne and no audience. He implied with the directness that characterized everything he did, that Harlan's confidence was the confidence of performance, that his boldness was the boldness of a man who had learned, only over a long career, how to appear bold rather than be it, that the man standing in front of him was a very good actor, playing a very convincing general. The interpreter completed the translation in a voice approximately half its normal volume. The room stopped managing its awareness of the conversation in the corner. The conversations nearest to them simply ceased. The officers standing in the wider circle went completely still. The band was still playing something that nobody was hearing anymore. Calloway set his glass down on a nearby table. He took one step toward the corner of the room and then stopped, understanding that the moment for intervention had passed. Whatever happened in the next 30 seconds was going to happen. Harlan stepped forward, not aggressively, not with the physical communication of a man losing control of himself. One deliberate step, which reduced the distance between him and Volkov by perhaps 18 inches, and which had the effect, because of who Harlan was and how he moved, and what 60 years of accumulated physical authority communicated, of changing the geometry of the conversation entirely. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. Then he said, with a calm that was more unsettling than anger would have been, that he would be happy to demonstrate his relationship with danger at any time and in any place of the marshal's choosing. He said that if the marshal had a specific proposal, he should make it clearly enough that everyone present could hear it. Now he said that he had spent 30 years in uniform preparing for exactly the kind of war that the Red Army claimed exclusive credit for winning, and that his record was available for examination by anyone who wanted to examine it without selective omission. He paused. Then he said the thing that everyone in that room would remember. He said that in his observation, and he had made careful observations over a long career, the most dangerous thing about the Soviet military was not its soldiers, who had fought with extraordinary courage under extraordinary conditions, and for whom he had genuine and specific admiration. The most dangerous thing was its generals, who had, through long experience of a very particular system, learned to confuse two things that were not the same thing. He said they had learned to confuse surviving a dictator with understanding war. What followed was not an explosion. It was something quieter and more consequential. Volkov looked at Harlan for a long moment. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had been struck without warning. It was the expression of a man absorbing a strike he had partly anticipated, calibrating its force, deciding what it meant for what came next. He was, even in this moment, processing rather than reacting. But underneath the processing, visible briefly to the officers, close enough to see clearly, was something that was not calculation and was not fury, though it contained elements of both. Something that looked in the fraction of a second before it was controlled, like recognition. Like a man who has spent his entire adult life navigating a system that required him to be something other than what he was, and who has just heard that system named by someone who had no reason to know what it cost. He turned and spoke quietly to his interpreter, and then to the senior officer of his delegation. The Soviet group shifted, not all at once, not dramatically, but with the coordinated movement of people who had been given a signal and understood what it meant. They moved to the other side of the room, maintaining the form of social engagement while removing themselves from the specific location where things had gone in a direction that was no longer useful. The conversation was over. Harlan watched them go. He did not look satisfied. He did not look regretful. He looked like a man who has said what was true and understands that truth of this kind carries its own consequences, and has made his peace with those consequences in advance. Calloway watched from across the room as the Soviet delegation resettled on the far side. He watched Harlan stand alone by the window. He watched the American officers nearby moving toward Harlan with the expressions of men who had just witnessed something they would be thinking about for a long time. He picked up his glass from the table where he had set it down and held it without drinking, and thought about the report he was going to have to write before morning. He thought about Washington. He thought about what this evening was going to be used for, and by whom, and to what end. And the calculation he arrived at was not a comfortable one. He had known, when he added Harlan's name to the guest list, that something like this was possible. He had told himself it was manageable. Standing in this room now, watching the carefully maintained geography of two delegations on opposite sides of a suddenly very large hall, he understood that he had been wrong about that. And he understood something else, something he had been not understanding for several months, with the particular effort that not understanding requires when the evidence keeps accumulating. He understood that the evening had not gone wrong. It had gone exactly as someone had planned. He just needed to be honest with himself about which side had done the planning. Decker from the door had watched all of it. Surely he had been too far away to hear the words over the band, and the distance, and the acoustic complexity of a large room full of people. But he had seen the geometry, the way the two men had moved toward each other, the stillness of the watching officers, the deliberate step, the moment of absolute silence, and then the Soviet delegation's coordinated withdrawal. He had seen Calloway set down his glass and take that one step forward and stop. He had seen the look on the faces of the American officers who had been close enough to hear. And then he had seen something that none of those officers had seen because none of them had been looking at the right place at the right moment. He had seen it from across the room, from his position by the door, with the particular angle of a man who was watching everything at once, because that was his job and had always been his job. In the moment after the Soviet group turned away, in the brief interval between Volkov completing his last exchange with Harlan and turning to speak to his delegation, Volkov had smiled. Not at Harlan, not at anyone in particular. A small, private expression, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, directed at nothing except whatever Volkov was thinking in that moment. It was not the smile of a man who had been bested in an argument. It was not satisfaction or vindication. It was something more specific and more cold than either of those things. Decker filed the image away without a frame for it. He did not mention it that evening or in the weeks that followed, but he did not forget it. It sat in the back of his memory with the quality of things that you know matter before you understand why. The reception continued for another 90 minutes. The band played. The champagne circulated. Toasts were made in both languages with the careful symmetry of official occasions. Photographs were taken. The two delegations maintained their positions on opposite sides of the room with a distance that was wide enough to be visible, but not so wide as to constitute an obvious diplomatic incident. When it was over, Harlan walked out through the main entrance without stopping to speak to anyone from the Soviet delegation. He walked down the steps with the same straightforward purposefulness with which he did everything. Decker had the car ready. Harlan got in. Decker pulled away from the entrance, down the circular drive, ironed in through the gates of the estate. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The road was dark and straight, cutting through the summer darkness of a country still sorting through the aftermath of its own destruction. The headlights picked out the edges of the road ahead, one section at a time, illuminating just enough of what was coming to navigate by, and no more. Then Harlan said, looking out the window, "You were close to the door all evening." "Yes, sir." "Good man." That was all. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it where he kept everything that mattered, inside where it could not be used against him. The morning after the reception, General Wade Harlan ate breakfast alone. He had always preferred the first hour of the day without company, without conversation, and without the particular demands that other people's presence placed on the part of him that was always, even when he did not want it to be, calculating and assessing and preparing. Breakfast was the one interval in his day that belonged entirely to him, and he had protected it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else. He ate eggs and toast and drank 2 cups of coffee at the small table by the window of his requisition quarters. Outside, the morning was clear and cool, the light coming in at the low angle of early hours. A German woman in a dark coat moved along the sidewalk, with her head down and her basket over her arm, going somewhere with the focused economy of someone who has learned not to waste motion. The world outside was managing itself with the ordinary persistence of worlds that have survived catastrophic things and found on the other side that the morning still comes and the day still requires attendance. Harlan watched it and drank his coffee and thought about Volkov. Not with anger. He was not constructed for sustained anger in any functional sense. He thought about the specific quality of the man, the intelligence, the calculation, the mastery of a particular kind of engagement that Harlan recognized as genuine skill, even as he had opposed it. Volkov was not a simple adversary. He was something considerably more sophisticated, which was a man who had learned to use the expectations of others as weapons, who had understood that in any engagement, the person who controls the emotional temperature controls the outcome. If he had tried to make Harlan angry, Harlan had refused. He had tried to make Harlan defensive. Harlan had been direct instead, and when he had finally aimed at the soldiers, he had gotten something he perhaps had not fully anticipated. Not anger, but clarity. The specific and unambiguous clarity of a man who has decided there is only one thing to say and is going to say it regardless of what it costs. Harlan finished his coffee. At approximately 9 o'clock, Calloway's chief of staff called and requested his presence at a meeting that afternoon. The call was professionally phrased. The chief of staff's voice was carefully neutral in the specific way that careful neutrality communicates urgency without appearing to. Harlan said he would be there. Calloway's office was in a requisitioned municipal building in the American sector. Built to suggest permanence, decorated to suggest importance, currently serving as the administrative center of an occupation force, still working out what an occupation was supposed to accomplish. Harlan arrived on time. He was shown in immediately. Calloway was standing behind his desk when Harlan entered, which told him something. Calloway was a man who sat when he was comfortable and stood when he was managing something he found difficult, and the meeting had not yet started. Calloway said, "Wade." Harlan said, "Richard." They sat. Calloway had a file folder in front of him that he did not open immediately, and he looked at Harlan for a moment with the expression of a man who has been composing what he wants to say for several hours and is deciding whether what he has composed is still what he wants to say. He said, "The Soviets filed a formal complaint through military channels this morning." Harlan said, "I expected they would." Calloway said, "It describes the American delegation's conduct as hostile, provocative, and contrary to the spirit of Allied cooperation." He paused. "It specifically names you." Harlan said, "I would be surprised if it didn't." Calloway opened the folder, looked at the document inside without reading from it. He had already read it several times. Then closed the folder. He said, "I need you to issue a formal apology to the Soviet delegation." The room was quiet for a moment. Harlan said, No." Calloway had expected this. He said, "Wade, this isn't about what was said or who started it. This is about the position it puts us in. The Soviets are going to use this. They're already using it." Harlan said, "Then let those communications circulate. Anyone reading them carefully will understand what actually happened. That's not how this works, and you know it. I know exactly how it works. Someone does something that requires a response. The response causes discomfort for people who preferred not to have the situation addressed, and the person who gave the honest response is asked to apologize for the honesty. I've participated in this process before, Richard." From the other side of the desk, Calloway looked at him. "Then you understand why I'm asking." "I understand why you're asking." "The answer is no." Harlan leaned forward slightly. "I did not start that conversation. I did not choose the subject or the tone. Volkov made a deliberate and calculated decision to stand in a room full of Allied officers and tell them that the men of the Third Army had not actually fought a real war. I was not going to stand there and let that be the last thing said. You told him that Soviet generals confused surviving a dictator with understanding war. That is an accurate observation. I stand by it." Calloway was quiet for a moment. He looked at the closed folder. He looked at the window. He looked finally back at Harlan with an expression that had shifted from the professional management of a difficult situation into something more complicated and less comfortable than management. He said, "I'm not going to tell you you're wrong." Wade. The statement landed in the room with the particular weight of things said when a man decides, in the middle of a conversation, he has been steering toward a specific destination, to stop steering. Harlan looked at him steadily. Calloway said, "About Volkov, about the Soviets, about what's coming." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you you're wrong because I don't believe you're wrong. I think you've been reading this situation more accurately than most people who outrank you and have more information than you do." Another pause. "I've believed that for some time." The room was very quiet. Harlan said slowly, "Then what are you telling me?" Calloway stood. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the German morning. The same clear light, the same ordinary persistence of a world getting on with things. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "Washington knows what's coming, Wade. Not all of it, not in detail, but the shape of the conflict that's going to develop. There are people in Washington who see it clearly, who have seen it clearly for a while. Harlan said, then act accordingly. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. Calloway turned from the window. His face had the look of a man who has spent a career learning to live with the gap between what is simple and what is possible. We need the Soviet alliance to hold for the next 2 to 3 years, he said, not because we trust it, not because we believe it will last, because the international architecture we're trying to build, none of it works without Soviet participation, not yet. Not until it's solid enough to hold without them. He looked directly at Harlan. You knew this. Going into that room last night, you knew this. Harlan said, I knew it. And you said what you said anyway. He called my soldiers cowards, Richard. He stood there and told every Allied officer present that the blood spent from Normandy to the Rhine was spent against an enemy that didn't count. I was not going to let that stand. Calloway nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who understands and cannot help. I know, he said. I know you weren't. I know why. He sat back down. He put his hands flat on the desk. But Wade, they needed you to do exactly what you did. Harlan went very still. Calloway said, the complaint they filed this morning is not a reaction. It's the plan. They came last night with the complaint already drafted. They needed something from you to attach it to. Something specific enough to be credible. Something that could be described as a provocation. He looked at Harlan steadily. Volkov gave you an insult you couldn't ignore because they needed an incident. They needed documentation. They've been building a file on you, your public statements, your communications, last night's exchange, and they're going to present it to the people in Washington who have been looking for a reason to move you out of command. The silence after that was the silence of a man absorbing the full shape of something he had suspected but not confirmed. Harlan said very quietly, and Washington will use it. Calloway did not answer immediately. He looked at the folder on his desk. He looked at his hands. Then he said the thing he had been not saying for months. You've been talking about running for office when you go home. There are individuals in Washington, not the Soviets, American individuals in positions of significant influence, who find the prospect of Wade Harlan in a political position, with his particular views and his particular willingness to express them publicly, to be a substantially more alarming problem than anything the Soviets have ever done. He met Harlan's eyes. They were going to find a reason to move you regardless. Volkov handed them a clean one. The room held them both in the particular stillness of a truth that has been said and cannot be unsaid. Harlan said finally in a voice that was completely level, so I was sold out by 2 enemies in the same evening. Calloway said nothing, but something in his expression answered the question as clearly as words would have. He had needed to tell someone the truth. Harlan was the only person in his life he trusted to hear it without flinching. Harlan stood. He straightened his uniform with 2 precise adjustments of his jacket. He looked at Calloway for a long moment. Not with anger, not with accusation, but with the careful assessment of a man revising his understanding of what 40 years of shared institutional life actually means. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Without turning, he said, Korea, Richard. Within 5 years. Mark it down somewhere, you'll see it again. He left. The formal order removing General Wade Harlan from command of the Third Army was issued 3 months later, in November of 1945. The language was the language of administrative reorganization, the post-war drawdown of forces, the restructuring of command arrangements, the routine realignment of a military shifting from wartime to peacetime footing. It said nothing about Bavaria. It said nothing about the Soviet complaint. It said nothing about Washington or the men in Washington who had found the complaint useful, or the process by which a career that had produced results the historical record would spend decades examining had been brought to its administrative conclusion. It said nothing because it did not need to. The language of institutions is very good at saying nothing while communicating everything to the people who know how to read it. Harlan did not contest it. He did not make public statements. He did not speak to the press. And he signed what required his signature, transferred his command with the thoroughness and professionalism that characterized everything he had ever done in uniform, and began spending his days with a legal pad in several pens, writing. Decker drove him less frequently now. The official schedule that had filled every hour of the general's days had contracted to almost nothing. But Harlan still went out. To walk, mostly, through the German towns and countryside he had come to know from maps and aerial photographs before he knew them from the ground. He walked the roads his army had advanced along. He stood in fields where things had happened. He looked at bridges and rivers with the sustained attention of a man reviewing his work. One morning, walking back to the car after standing for 20 minutes on a bridge over a river that had been a significant obstacle 18 months earlier, he said to Decker without preamble, "Do you know why they let us cross here without more resistance?" Decker said he didn't. Harlan said, "Because the division on the other side had been in continuous contact for 11 days. They were out of men who still had enough left to fight." He looked back at the bridge. "We moved fast because we built an army that could move fast. But we also moved fast because of what had been done to them before we got there. Both things are true." He paused. Volkov was right about the facts. He was wrong about what the facts meant. He was wrong about the men. A man can be right about the facts and completely wrong about what the facts mean. And that's different from lying. I've thought about it. They drove back in silence. That evening, Harlan wrote for several hours. He wrote about the Eastern Front and what he had studied of its operations. He wrote about the Soviet military, its strengths, its structural characteristics, the way it was organized and how it fought, and what he believed it would do in the years ahead. He wrote about Korea. He named it, placed it, explained in careful operational terms why he believed it would be the first theater of the conflict he had been describing for the past year. He wrote about the men who would fight that war without the equipment or the doctrine or the institutional understanding that would have been in place if different decisions had been made in the summer of 1945. He wrote as if someone would read it. He wrote as if it mattered that it existed, even if it never reached anyone who could use it. Decker brought him dinner at his desk that night and found him still writing, pages stacking up beside the legal pad, the ashtray holding the evidence of hours of sustained concentration. Harlan looked up, acknowledged the food, looked back at the page. He said without looking up again, "Roy, when you go home, when all this is done, and you're back in Pennsylvania or wherever life takes you, pay attention to what happens in the next few years. Pay attention to Asia." Decker said, "Asia, sir? The part of the world we just got finished deciding doesn't need our immediate attention. We're going to discover we were wrong about that." December 9th, 1945. The accident happened on a road outside Mannheim. A truck crossed the center line. The collision was low speed. Neither vehicle was moving fast. The road was straight. The morning was clear. The visibility was good. By every ordinary measure, it was the kind of accident that produces injuries, the kind that men walked away from. Wade Harlan did not walk away from it. He was the only fatality. The other occupants of the car sustained injuries that healed. The truck driver was unharmed. Harlan, who had survived 2 world wars and the particular violence of 4 decades in uniform, who had stood on open ground during artillery bombardments because he believed a general needed to be visible to his men, who had driven through active fire zones and crossed rivers under fire, died on a straight road on a clear morning at low speed. Roy Decker was not in the car. He had been scheduled to drive that morning. Well, he had driven Harlan every day for the better part of 2 years. But the night before, Harlan had told him to take the morning off, had said it without particular emphasis, without apparent reason, as a simple instruction delivered the way Harlan delivered all instructions, directly without elaboration, in a tone that did not invite discussion. Decker had not questioned it. He handed off the duty to another driver and spent the morning in his quarters, writing a letter home to his mother in Pennsylvania. He learned about the accident that afternoon. He sat with the information for a long time before he was able to think about it clearly. And when he was, the first thing he thought about, before the grief, before the disbelief, was that morning on the steps in Bavaria, 4 months earlier, when Harlan had told him to stay close to the door. A man who told him in advance where to stand. A man who had spent his entire career thinking several steps ahead of the situation he was currently in. A man who had told him, the night before he died, to take the morning off. He had never once in 2 years told Decker to take a morning off without a specific reason. Decker never spoke about this publicly. He carried it the way soldiers carry the things that don't fit the available categories. Not as a conclusion, because he had no conclusion, but as a question he had learned to live alongside. The official investigation found the accident to be exactly what it appeared to be: tragic, unlikely, the kind of thing that happens in the complicated machinery of post-war occupation. No irregularities were noted. No further investigation was recommended. In Moscow, in an office that handled a specific category of problems, a notation was made in a file. When that file was eventually declassified in the early 90s and translated by analysts working in a very different world than the one the file had been created in, the notation read, "The Harlan problem has been resolved. Resolution was not ours. We note it nonetheless." The analyst who translated it wrote two sentences in the margin. Ambiguous. Could mean they were informed after the fact. Could mean something else. The file did not clarify. It never did. Viktor Volkov lived until 1974. He outlived Harlan by 29 years. He survived Stalin, who died in 1953. He survived the political turbulence that followed, survived being purged a third time in the late 50s, survived his rehabilitation, survived the Cold War in its entirety. He attended official functions, received official honors, and remained until the end the most decorated military officer in Soviet history. He wrote memoirs published in Moscow in 1969. They covered the war in considerable detail, the operations, the campaigns, the decisions made under pressure. Military historians in both the East and the West considered them significant documents. He did not mention the Bavaria reception. He did not mention Wade Harlan. He did not mention, in any of the hundreds of pages he committed to writing, the summer evening when two very different men had stood in a room together and said true things to each other at significant cost. Historians who interviewed Volkov in the 60s noted that he had an extraordinary memory for operational detail. Dates, coordinates, unit designations, the specific texture of decisions. He remembered things clearly and described them with precision. The gaps in his account were therefore not the gaps of a man who had forgotten. They were the gaps of a man who had chosen. Roy Decker came home to Pennsylvania in 1946. He worked, married, raised children, and watched his country do the things his general had told him his country was going to do. Korea in 1950. 36,000 Americans dead on a peninsula that policy had decided didn't require immediate attention in the summer of 1945. Vietnam following from Korea with the terrible logic of problems not addressed at their origins. The Cold War stretching across decades, consuming resources and lives and possibilities, structured around a confrontation that one man in the summer of 1945 had described with specific accuracy to people who found accuracy inconvenient. Decker watched all of it the way men watch things they were warned about in advance but could not prevent, with the complicated feeling of someone who knows the shape of what is happening and cannot stop thinking about the man who drew that shape years before anyone else could see it. He mentioned Volkov's smile for the first time in 1983 in a conversation with his son, who was then a retired Army officer and had asked about General Harlan after reading something about the post-war period. What Decker said, what he had been holding unspoken for 38 years, was that he had always believed from the moment he saw that smile that Volkov had not come to Bavaria to win an argument. He had come to end a career, and the smile was the smile of a man who had just confirmed that the ending was in motion. His son was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did Harlan know that it was a setup?" Decker thought about a legal pad in a requisition building in Germany in the fall of 1945. He thought about a bridge over a river and a man standing on it looking at the water and talking about the nature of being right. He thought about steps in Bavaria and a simple instruction about where to stand and a morning off that came from nowhere. He said he knew. I think the knowing was the part that cost him most. Not being removed from command, not any of it. The knowing. He paused. He told me once he wasn't afraid of being wrong. He said he was afraid of being right. In December of 1991, Roy Decker was 74 years old. He sat in his kitchen in western Pennsylvania and watched the Soviet Union dissolve on television. His son, who had driven 4 hours to be with him for reasons neither of them had fully articulated, sat across the table. They watched it happen without talking much. The images from Moscow, the flags coming down, the end of the thing that had been built by the men who had been in that room in Bavaria, the system that had sent Volkov to do what Volkov had done, the structure that had run for 46 years and consumed everything it could reach and had finally, on this morning, run out of what it needed to continue. After a while, Decker's son said, "He was right about all of it, wasn't he?" It was not a question. Decker said, "Nah, he was right about all of it." His son said, "Korea, Vietnam, the whole thing, the whole thing." Decker looked at the television. He told Callaway Korea within 5 years. It was 5 years. He told me to pay attention to Asia. I paid attention to Asia and watched American boys die there for 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. He was right about the Soviets being the next enemy, right about what the post-war settlement was going to produce, right about what kind of men he was dealing with on both sides of that room in Bavaria. His son said, "And they removed him for it. They removed him for it. And he died on a straight road on a clear morning, and nobody in authority found anything worth looking at twice." Decker looked at the television. People in Moscow. The flags coming down. "And I was supposed to be driving that car." His son said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Decker picked up his coffee cup, held it without drinking, set it back down. Outside the kitchen window, the Pennsylvania morning was clear and cold and ordinary. The kind of morning that keeps happening regardless. The kind that comes after everything. After wars, after the men who fight them, after the systems that build and consume, and finally exhaust themselves. He said quietly, "He told me the night before to take the morning off. Never did that. 2 years, never once told me to take a morning off without a reason." He looked at his son. He knew something was coming. I don't know what he knew or how he knew it, but he knew enough to make sure I wasn't in that car. His son said, "Dad." Decker shook his head once, and not dismissing the sympathy, receiving it, and then setting it aside, because there was one more thing to say, and he wanted to say it clearly. He said, "The thing about Wade Harlan was not that he was brave. Lots of men are brave. It's not that he was smart. The Army had plenty of smart men. The thing about him was that he could not make himself say something he did not believe was true, not to the press, not to his superiors, not to a Soviet marshal in a room full of people at a reception in Bavaria. He just could not do it. It was not in him." He paused. And that one thing, that single inability to perform a version of himself that wasn't real, that was what made him dangerous to everyone who needed the world to be something other than what it was. That was why they couldn't keep him. None of that was why he had to go. On the television screen in Moscow, the last flag came down. Decker watched it and said nothing more. He had said what needed saying. He had said it to the right person. Outside, the Pennsylvania morning continued its ordinary business, indifferent and persistent, the way mornings are. The same kind of morning that Wade Harlan had looked at from a window in Bavaria in the summer of 1945, drinking his coffee, thinking about what was true, preparing himself for what he was going to say and what it was going to cost. He had paid the cost. He had known the cost before he paid it. He had looked at it clearly and paid it anyway, the same way he had looked at everything in his life, without flinching, without pretending it was something other than what it was, and without adjusting his understanding of it to match what he wished were true. That was who he was, a man who told the truth in rooms where the truth was expensive, and never once, in 60 years, decided that the price was more than it was worth. Korea came. Vietnam came. The Cold War ran its long and costly course, and at the end of it, in a kitchen in Pennsylvania, an old soldier watched the thing his general had named clearly and specifically and at great personal cost in the summer of 1945, finally come to its conclusion on a television screen. It had ended exactly the way Harlan said it would end. It had just taken the rest of a century to get there.